Okay.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to everybody for joining this workshop. So the workshop takes place in like 5 parts, and it's all about delivering RDM services. So looking at the different perspectives from service providers, institutions that are maybe procuring or running services, or different open source providers. And I wanted to just give you a little bit of introduction to the workshop. We've been a little bit overwhelmed by how many people have been interested and signed up. So I'll just do a little bit of intro, and then we'll go into the initial talks and the panel. So there are many organisers of this workshop. We had planned this for the RDA plenary in Melbourne. That was meant to happen in March this year. So we've got people from different areas of the world. Sean Ross and Catherine Answorth are both from Australia, so I'd been involved in the prep then. And Marta and Laurian and Carmen and Kevin have been involved, and Tamsin as well, have been involved in discussions in the UK. So we got people from various places helping to coordinate the workshop, and you'll see them on different days running the different parallel sessions. And I wanted to also just say thanks to all of you. We've had 145 people sign up for the workshop from a whole range of different countries. So hopefully we can have a very global discussion here and learn about what's working well in different places, or what challenges people have faced, and how we can address some of those. In terms of the participants, the type of people that signed up, we asked on the kind of registration form who people were, where they were coming from. Most people were providing data services, I think either as, kind of commercial service providers, or people within institutions that are providing services for their researchers, or also purchasing and procuring data services. But we did have a lot of people identify as researchers or software developers, or people who are brokering services at a national level, like the NRENs that we work with through GÉANT. So there's a whole range of kind of like perspectives that we'll hopefully get in the different discussions. And when we asked people what they would like to see in terms of the services, most people wanted to understand like the state of the art in terms of delivering research data management services, what's working well, what different institutions are doing. And that's the primary focus of the workshop and the various sessions we're running. So I think we'll hopefully meet most people's needs. A lot of people were interested in gaining new insights, or the different kind of innovative services that they could leverage on. So again, kind of learning from other people in the audience. And then a number of people were interested in some of the topics that we have throughout the week. So ideas on how to offer or sustain open source software. That's one of our focuses. We know there's quite a lot of different open source tools, and it can be quite hard to transition to a sustainable business model there. So that's something we want to focus on specifically. Some people were interested in learning about research data management in general. I'm not sure we'll cover all of those needs, but certainly from a service perspective, we will do. So hopefully you'll learn, even if you're not dealing with services directly. And people were also interested in just making connections and networking, meeting other people in the space. And that's something we really want to address. We want to help people connect with peers in other organizations so that you can learn lessons from them and potentially collaborate in future. So the schedule for the week, we have a 2-hour session each day. So today is just an opening panel where we really want to try and hear different perspectives that tie into the main themes of the workshop. So we're going to have a number of talks that pick up on procurement issues. So Laurian will speak about the example at Leicester University. We'll also hear about open source business models, and also about the Invest in Open Infrastructure from Caitlin. And we'll be thinking about partnership models as well. So Susanna will talk about the Chris example from Italy. And then throughout the week, we'll have sessions that focus on these specifically. And in each of those sessions, we want to try and develop some resources, so some guidance that comes from all of our experiences, or some kind of, pointers for people who are going into similar exercises. And then we'll wrap it up at the end of the week with just a closing panel. You can get all of the links on the main website. So this GÉANT wiki page, we're adding all the slides to that, so you'll be able to get those as we go through. And we'll also put the recordings up. We're going to record each session. So some basic housekeeping. We'd ask people to kind of mute unless they're presenting or asking a question, just so we can avoid too much background noise. You can raise your hand if you want to, speak out, or you can raise questions in the chat if you've got any tech issues. We've got a number of people helping coordinate this, so by all means, raise issues there. And as we get into the breakout sessions over the next 3 days, we'd ask you all to be active and contribute to those discussions, share your lessons, by entering into those Google Docs. They're open to everyone to edit, but we would ask you to also be courteous. We're conscious they're a fairly big group, so try and make sure that everyone has a chance to speak. As I mentioned a moment ago, we are recording all of this and the slides will go online. And if you follow the hashtag #DeliverRDM, that's where you'll see the Twitter feed or any information about the event. So I wanted to just ask a couple of questions just from the audience before I hand over to Kevin to give us a kind of overview to service delivery. So if you go to Menti and enter the code 6255479, we have 3 quick questions just to see what you'd like out of the week. So I'm just gonna come out of this and hopefully just jump to the Menti. Okay, see, you're already there. You're all very quick off the mark. So the first question, we haven't actually planned any kind of social element to this. There's a 2-hour day and there will be discussion. But we did have a question about whether we should include something. And we do have options for that, whether it's some kind of coffee break thing, even before the event or whatever timing works best for people. One of our colleagues, Catherine Unsworth, at the Skills Summit in Australia, they used a thing called Run the World, I think it's called, which is a program where you're able to kind of connect people up and just do a 5-minute chat. So it randomly partners people up. So if people are interested in this, we'll maybe, I'd see a number of people are kind of maybe on this or yes, it's kind of quite evenly split. But if people would like something like that, we could trial it later in the week, maybe have a half-hour session where people can just network with others. So we could start a sign-up sheet if people would like to do that. The second question here is just really to understand, how you'd characterize your participation in the workshop. So some people are just here to listen and learn or to make new contacts. Some people have questions to ask, which is good. So there is a Slido that we'll paste in the chat for questions today, but also during, the next sessions you will be able to ask as well. And people have ideas to share, which again is good to see because we want to try and develop resources collectively together. So a nice split there. And the final question I was going to ask is about how you feel about the workshop. So people are curious, interested, enthusiastic, late. I'm usually late to everything, so please don't worry about being late. Open to learn, motivated. Nice. Good. Well, I'm hoping the week, we've got a lot of interesting speakers and some interesting topics. So I think there'll be a lot that people can learn from, and I hope we get some really interesting discussion and debate. So that's all I wanted to cover. I'm going to stop my share and hand over to Kevin. And Kevin's going to give us a quick introduction, really just to ground us in the themes of the week, what we want to achieve.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Just shift this to presenting mode. There we are. Hopefully that's...
Yeah, that's working.
You're all seeing that now? Good.
Yeah.
So this title is subtly different from the one in the programme. It's the same words. I put a question mark at the end of it. Because as I was working my way through it, I actually did wonder, are we working towards the same destination? I hope to explain that a little bit more by the time I get to the end of this 15 minutes. So what I'm planning to cover is really just first to outline the ways that I see that we can both develop, provide, and purchase services, where purchasing is what we're trying to do. And I'm very conscious this has gaps. I mean, you see from the last bullet point here, I mean, this is partly informed. I was horrified to realise that the first procurement exercise I was involved in as a buyer was 40 years ago. I've been on both sides of this, and I've got experience in developing collaborative services. So I hope I've got some relevant experience, but I'm also conscious, I'm an old git now. I'm not necessarily in touch with everything, and I'm sure that I'm going to hear some models during this week that I'm not going to cover now, that I'm going to learn something as well. And that's one of the reasons I'm excited about this. I hope to consider the perspective both of the provider and the purchaser when those terms make sense, looking at the constraints that we're all working in, depending on the different kind of models we're looking at, and the advantages and the disadvantages of different approaches. So, the first way we can approach trying to do this, and I realise a lot of what I'm going to say is actually not very specific to RDM services. It could apply to lots of things, but I think the way in which it's specific to these is in considering the maturity of those services and the maturity of the different types of options we've got. And once upon a time, not all that long ago, really building it yourself was really the only option. We might not end up with something quite as elegant as this, but some people might worry that might be the end result. But clearly, one of the advantages we have with something like this is that we can build just about whatever we want. But the concept of what building it yourself means, I think often has different meanings to different people. Again, and another reference to my advancing age, I can recall a time when universities still built their own operating systems, never mind anything else. And I was involved in running the national network in the UK at a time when we were building our own hardware to do some of that. Nobody is going to suggest that that's what building your own means now. But so, we're advancing that notion of what it is that we're building and what it is that is as a commodity up the layers, as it were. But at any one time, we're always clear about what that means. It's now more likely to imply some degree of local hosting and maintenance, probably of some open source products. And sometimes it might imply, extensive customization of what might be standard off-the-shelf components, again, to deliver something that's really suited to what we need within a particular organization. But I think one thing we can say is that all services to some extent are home built, even when we're going out and purchasing off the shelf products and services for other people. For instance, in most, I think just about all research performing organizations, nobody is yet talking about contracting out the sort of local support and advice that we give to our researchers, even if that support and advice is about a standard product being supplied by a commercial supplier or any of the other alternatives I'm about to describe. So one way perhaps to think about what does building our own really mean is that it's about going it alone. It's about saying our service is our service. We're not doing it with anybody else. We buy bits in that we need and everything else we do ourselves. So that's how I'm going to view that going forwards. But one small step away from that is collaborating to some extent, forming small groups, multi-party collaborative services that are a logical step away. And that's often built, I think certainly in the case of universities, on existing cooperation that may exist in other areas of services. And I know we're going to hear examples of a number of people who've done this sort of thing this week, 40U, from which Margaret's one example. There are others in the UK and elsewhere. And I get the feeling, I don't have hard numbers to back this up, that this is a more common model in the US, for instance, than it is in many parts of Europe. So that can involve sharing the infrastructure. It might involve sharing some of those support and advice services, sharing the production of guidance, or sharing purchasing. And in shared support models, for instance, one of the modes might be that different universities or other research organizations in this club may concentrate on supporting a particular domain of research and being able to provide more in-depth advice for that. And collectively, they're covering all the domains. So one of the advantages that has is that we get economies of scale, and that can work for small and large organizations, and a potentially richer service, for instance, through that model of concentrating on different domains, for instance. But of course, as soon as you involve more people, you've got complex issues of governance. there will always be some universities that are too proud to do, effectively that feeling that if you have to do something with somebody else, it's kind of an admission of weakness. And so even where it is an advantage for some, I think they may be reluctant to go down that path. And I think history also shows us that scaling and the longevity of things like this can be a challenge, particularly where the collaborations in some cases are built on, I think, what are often personal contacts between organizations. And given the sort of turnover we have in many of those, making sure that the collaboration outlasts the individuals who put it together is a key issue. And not everybody gets that right. And certainly scaling can be problematic. So another level beyond that are things that I guess I characterize more as clubs, membership organizations of some sort. Some are created by their members, and I think some emerge from community created solutions or even things that were originally developed through grant funding, where somebody sees that a membership model is one sustainability solution to that. Some of them come from more top-down, even prescribed sort of things. GÉANT and SURF in the UK and the Netherlands are examples of that, where universities can choose to join GÉANT, that through that they get some services as a right, and others on a menu that are optional extras where they can buy into. OSF is another type of club, I think, that is more perhaps that community created solution. So the thing that joins these together, I think, in some way, is that we can choose to join them, and that we assume that what distinguishes them from some other service that we might be buying, because we're usually paying into this, is that there's a non-profit element to it. It's something in a sense that we feel that we own in a way that we don't own a commercial service. So that's one of the advantages, I think, of this sort of model, the economies of scale, again, that we get, and the fact that it's a service that's driven by its members usually, and the exact way in which that happens varies, but you can be more confident that what's being delivered is something that may not be exactly what each member wants, but the members collectively are deciding what's best for the collective. The things that are either bad or difficult is, well, governance, even more complex in something like this. And that's certainly an area where if you get governance wrong, the type of trust and the loyalty that people have to your membership organization goes wrong very quickly. And I know we're going to be hearing from others again today and later in the week who've got a lot more experience with this area than I do. One of the issues can be often that things like this often involve services in bundles, and it's like lots of other things that you buy. You get into it because there's something particular that you want, and in some models it comes with a whole bunch of other things that perhaps you're not so keen on, and it doesn't include some of the things that you really want. And depending on the purchasing model or the membership model, you may be stuck with paying for things that you feel actually this is not really of value to us. And I think in some organizations, it can be either a good thing or a bad thing, but in some cases, justifying the spend to join a club, as it were, as opposed to buying something can be quite difficult. Whereas in others, I think this is easier. And I wonder sometimes if that's one of the reasons why there are areas of the world where this is a more prevalent model, perhaps because the notion of a subscription to something that we're a member of is an easier sell than a purchase for a service. In other cases, I think it works the other way. And I'd be interested to hear how people's experience in that as we go through the week. And then, of course, we can go through the route of procurement. We'll go out and we'll buy something commercial off the shelf. One of the things that has changed in the last few years is that there are commercial providers now for some aspects of these RDM services, for repositories, for things like this. Procurement requires different sets of skills. We need to think very hard about what we want to buy, and we need to be able to specify that really accurately for the procurement to work for us. And procurement can mean different sorts of things. It's usually only above a certain level of spend that you need to go through formal processes with competitions. Procurement sometimes can just mean deciding, we're going to buy this, I'm going to have a look around, hey, that looks good, let's buy it. And in the UK, I think often the limit for that is somewhere around the 10, 11, 12,000 pound mark, similar in euros. It varies in different territories, but that notion of a split is commonplace. So sometimes that means pricing a service at the right level can help people sell in markets that they might otherwise find difficult. And even when we buy this in, as we're aware, we're not able to buy all of it in. There are still things we've got to do ourselves, and we still need to think quite hard about what is it that we need to do locally, what is it that we're buying in, and how do those two things fit together. But there's no doubt that outsourcing can be a good fit for some organisations and for some types of services. And if you're a believer in markets, it ought to help you control costs, although as we see in some markets are incredibly imperfect in this respect and don't really operate as markets. And in some cases, when budgets are being challenged, having a contract that you've committed to spend money with an outside organisation for a number of years can protect your spending in a way that might be difficult if you were spending that money internally on a homegrown solution, which becomes a target for cuts. Of course, the downside of that is that you continue to spend the money on the outsourced solution, and the cuts internally become even worse than they were before, and you end up with a service that you can't support. But this works both ways. I say the difficulties here is that, as I said, specifying requirements really well is a skill that few of us possess. I've done it lots of times, and I still don't. I've still got lots to learn. And there are people for whom this is a specialism in itself. And the evaluation of what you get back is also just as difficult. I think sometimes also the market is actually a bad fit to what we want. Now, if that's really the case, you should never have gone to procurement at all. You should only ever go out and conduct that sort of exercise if you're very confident that there are a number of solutions out there that are going to fit what you want. And yet I see many examples of procurements where people haven't taken that into account, and they end up with everything that comes back as a really poor fit to what they want. And as I'm sure we're going to hear multiple times, the very nature of procurement suddenly rules out different ways of doing things. It can make it very hard if you then realize that actually one of those things, like the membership model, might be the best fit, because those things are often not designed to be able to respond to these sorts of commercial exercises. And thinking about it from the other point of view, because this has all been from the point of view of the research organisation looking to say, how am I going to build my service? If I'm on the other side of this, and we are, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about that tomorrow as a supplier of DMP Online and our experience with these things, you need to choose how you're going to supply things. Are you going to go for the club, for the membership model, or for some other type of community solution? Are you going to try and sell what you've got as an off-the-shelf commodity? Or increasingly important, are you going to think of yourself as a service solution that actually you might be reliant on other people to sell? Increasingly, and certainly in lots of forms of IT, the notion of solution providers, solution integrators, who create yet another interface between you and the service you're buying. Effectively, they're like personal shoppers that go out and pull together the right mix of things to service what you want. And in some cases, it's important to have relationships with those. And as with the purchaser, if you're a supplier, engaging in procurements requires expertise and resources that you may not have. You'll frequently find yourself responding to procurements that are really badly written. And even where you think you've got the exact fit for what these people want, they've done such a bad job of describing what they want, it's very difficult for you to make your case. You'll often have standard contracts, and your purchaser will have standard contracts, and you'll end up in a battle between whose bits of which contract are we actually going to use to apply to these things. And although it is possible to behave like more than one of those things above, it's not necessarily that easy. So I'm a great fan of analogies, and I'm going to work this one as hard as I can until you're all sick of it. But I think it's a useful way to think about these things. Imagine that instead of going out to buy a research data service, I want some apples. So I could plant my own apple tree, and that's great. I can choose exactly what sort of apples I want. It's quite a lot of work to keep it alive, but it's great. Freshly grown. What could be better? Apples in your own garden. But on the other hand, maybe I want something other than apples, and actually my apple tree produces more apples than I really want. Getting together with a few friends, and somebody's got a plum tree and somebody's got a pear tree. Hey, that's great. Now we've all got more variety, and we're sharing the work and the benefits, and it's still got lots of the homegrown things. Or I could go down with that club model and say, look, I've got an orchard. If a whole bunch of us get together, you know, we'll form a committee to decide what to grow in the orchard and how to do it, and it'll be wonderful for all of us. Another option, which I'm not sure it fits in with any of the procurement options, but I'll put it in here anyway, is I'm going to go for one of those pick your own places where you go down to the farmer and they've done the hard work of growing the apples, you do the work of picking it, and it's a kind of another split of labour, and it's probably cheaper than buying those from a store. But actually the commonest way many of us do it is that we'll go down to a farmer's market, a shop or something like that. There'll be multiple people selling apples. I'll wander around a bit and I'll pick the apples that look nicest or at the best price or whatever. Or I can do it the way we usually do procurement. So I'm going to turn up at the market and I've got a set of specifications for my apple related services. I'd quite like, ideally, for you to be able to supply some recipes with the apples. I want to know what happens if any of the apples are bad and how you're going to compensate me for that. And I'm going to hand around my specifications to all the people on the stalls and work out who's got the best response. Now, clearly, if I'm going to buy a basket of apples, the stallholders are not going to engage with me. But if I'm a wholesaler and I'm going to buy a few tons of apples, perhaps they'll be interested in having a conversation. And that's probably as far as we were to take that analogy now. So just some final thoughts on these models, and I'm sure, as I say, more that we're going to hear about in the course of this week. Although we started out with this idea that, yeah, there's different ways of getting there, but in the end, we're still going to end up with RDM services, I don't think the outcomes are necessarily the same. There's certainly no one pathway that's right for everyone. I don't think we're going to end up with a recommendation like that. But it is worrying that in some cases, I think the short-term challenges of how to satisfy the requirements of my organisation this year or this month can get in the way of the long-term interests of both my own organisation and the community collectively. Individual choices by organisations, let's say going to procurement, may lead to outcomes that are actually the right outcome for that organisation at that time. They're the wrong outcome for us as a community together. And we need to find ways of aligning those more. If we are going down the route of procurements, we need to educate those who drive them to make sure that we're specifying these things the right way. And we ourselves, as people working within research organisations, need to learn how to use them more effectively. Those community suppliers, the membership organisations, I think also need to find ways to act in multiple roles. But at least I'm encouraged that through the course of this week, we've got the opportunity to learn a lot about this, and I hope to act on it as well in order to improve the outcomes for everyone. Thanks very much.
That was excellent. Thank you very much, Kevin. Some really nice analogies and ways of describing all the different approaches we could take there. So I'll hand over to Laurian, who's going to talk to us about the experiences going through a procurement exercise at Leicester University. Just wait for the screen share to start. Here we go. Yep. If you just flick it to the full screen. I think it's still thinking.
It takes a little while. I don't think it. Let me just swap my presenter view.
Yeah, no worries. That's excellent. Yeah, that's on now.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. So good evening, everybody. It was really interesting, Kevin's talk, because it was making me think that certainly at Leicester, when we were thinking about procuring an institutional data repository, we had no club to join, definitely not. And we certainly went to the market with our specifications, and that was the right outcome for our organisation at that time. But it's made me think a little bit about, is that the right outcome for the future, for sustainability of services? So it was really interesting. So as I said, my name is Laurian, and I led a procurement exercise at the University of Leicester, which was initially going to be an RDM project that was going to last about a year, but it took us 2.5 years from the project planning stage to the actual delivery of our platform. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the story that we went through during that time. For those of you who don't know, the University of Leicester is a research-intensive university located in the Midlands of England within the UK, but it isn't part of the very big Russell Group research-intensive universities. So in 2016, it was really important to acknowledge that we didn't have a data repository. What we did have was a research information system, a CRIS, which was symplectic, and a very old, creaking DSpace publications repository that was locally hosted, but with very little support. So I think the local context and drivers are really important when we, particularly for us, when we were considering what would we do and how would we procure a data repository. What we do know without a doubt is there, and as I hope we'll get that as I'm going through the presentation, is there was certainly a demand for something that was an institutional data platform. At that time in 2016, there was a huge amount of drivers from funders and the Open Data Concordat, and suddenly there was this thought that not everybody has a disciplinary repository. So actually, where were people expected to share their data at the end of the research output? So there was sector drivers, funder drivers, and institutional drivers as well. But it's really important to put that local kind of drive and context into this narrative that I'll go through today. So what is really interesting, and perhaps is my first lesson learnt, so my background was very much as a librarian. I'd been working in medical libraries. I had worked for GÉANT, so I'd worked on some open access projects, RDM projects. I had been the research data manager at Sheffield, and so I kind of was quite aware of RDM, its challenges, service challenges, human infrastructure and technical infrastructure. But boy, I really didn't know quite what it would be like to go through a procurement process to deliver an institutional data repository. Your management of stakeholders, it was just so significant. Some were very relevant. Others were not quite sure what we were trying to deliver. Others felt that we were kind of swimming in their lane. You're the university library. What are you doing talking about data? Is it this high performance computing data? No, it isn't. So your stakeholder management is significant. And I've just put a few of the people there. But the last point is perhaps the most important point of all, which certainly hadn't been considered by many of those stakeholders, is what did our research community want? Had anybody thought about asking them what they wanted from an institutional offering? And I think that was really key. So you're managing stakeholder expectations. You may be working in quite an uncomfortable space at times at the beginning. You are pushing people's boundaries. You're working across boundaries. And it's quite a challenging thing to do. I mean, and I know that every institution will have a different approach, but I can certainly say that in 2016, this really did feel a very, very challenging thing to try and take forward. But our timeline really, so initially, I came into post in February 2016 as the Open Access and Research Data Manager. And my first objective was given to me, which was to procure research data storage and a research data discovery platform, of which obviously we didn't have any of those for research data outputs. The storage was quite an okay process to procure because we could do it through GÉANT. And we bought archive and data storage and also 2 on-site physical appliances as well, and minimal amount of storage requirements. It was basically how could we gauge what storage we would require for research data outputs. So we just went for the 50 terabyte. But during that period as well, so I had just come into post, and within I think 3 months, my manager had left. who was the person that was pretty much my senior stakeholder in this. And at the same time, the University Library was going through a reorganisational restructure. So you're trying to drive through a quite an important institutional project, but dealing with all those local changes. There's no doubt that during this period was the most important period in 2016 was to prepare for the tender and the procurement process. And this is what I'll be talking about this evening. So the functional and non-functional requirements, what Kevin has just said about how difficult that is, and there are experts in this area, I would say agreeing the functional and non-functional requirements was the most significant piece of work prior and during the procurement process. It was significant, particularly with IT colleagues. That was a significant piece of work. But at the same time, we were, I did a survey of our research staff and PhD students, an RDM survey, and also to inform my thinking actually in this area and to try and influence some of the user requirements that were coming in from the other stakeholders. I conducted about 35 detailed research data pathfinder interviews with our PhD students, early career researchers, and our senior academics, and some grant holders, some funded, and obviously some not, across all three colleges, almost like as an evidence to supplement lots of the functional requirements as well, and to get the user story and the user perspective. Not always positive. Each interview lasted about 90 minutes, but it gave me great evidence in some ways around what people's requirements were, because we couldn't assume what people wanted to know. The other big piece of work that was very difficult, even though I was the RDM project manager, it didn't take very long to realise that we needed somebody in IT services to take on RDM as well and to work alongside me, basically so that could give me access to the important people in IT, research infrastructure team, for example, and that took a significant amount of time for IT to get to actually allocate some resource to that, but they did eventually during that period. Requirements gathering, documenting it takes a significant amount of time. We had hundreds of requirements by the time we went out for procurement. It was very new to me. This was my first procurement process, and I had never really been involved in such detailed requirements gathering around functional and non-functional requirements. So that's the second lesson really, is to, you may not have an expert within your institution, but it's really, really important to work together with the other stakeholders, because by the time you go out for procurement, you've pretty much got to agree, particularly on those mandatory, should, and we would love to have, is nice to have, you know, it's really breaking it down for every activity. This is an example of something that I was sent in the project early on, where, and I think it shows you how you have these different professions, and I thought this was quite funny. I don't know if you can see line 50, which is delightfulness, going beyond expectations in ways that create delight. I didn't think that was a requirement, actually, until I was persuaded otherwise. So I think Kevin was talking about the skills and how you're learning, actually, as you're gathering these requirements and working with others. It is a significant piece of work. But alongside that, of course, you're working with your enterprise architects within the institution as well. I can't tell you how many of these kind of things we did around operating models, what the concepts were, uploading, downloading, lots of different things that we were working on there. And all of this takes time, because we certainly didn't have a big research data management team. We're quite short-staffed, we're quite lean. So it was just actually getting lots of people's time to start working on these kind of components. And again, however you document and agree your functional and non-functional requirements, starting with spreadsheets, which just built and built and built, and then trying to work out what is a must, what is should, and what would be nice to have. And we did eventually come to some agreement. And of course, all the evidence we got from our user stories and our pathfinders formed an important component of these requirements. So just before we go out to procurement, this is perhaps the biggest lesson, it was expect the unexpected. I thought it was quite a clear project. We knew what we were doing, going out to procure a shiny brand new data repository and platform. And then I was told, could I possibly go out to replace our publications platform under the same procurement process? We had spent months doing our requirements for a data repository. We hadn't thought about our publications, and which is obviously the live publications thesis repository on our old DSpace platform. And is it a one solution for data publications and thesis, which is a question that I think I'd like to explore more probably in the discussions tomorrow, because that was a challenge. It really did change the nature of what we were going out to procure, because they wanted one solution, one procurement process. So that was the game changer, really. So anybody who's gone through an EU tender, I've just put a couple of the things there that, that you go through. I was led through this procurement process by a fantastic procurement manager who had done this many, many times. I'm so glad she did, because there's so much paperwork and confidentiality and contracts and notices and things that you're working through that I certainly had never encountered before. So we did set out through a PIN notice our intentions to purchase. We had 23 expressions of interest. This is really interesting for me because some were expected, others I wasn't quite sure why they actually expressed an interest in this particular PIN notice. But eventually it came down through all of the evaluation scoring to 3. So we had 3 providers, 3 vendors. They, as a minimum, fulfilled all the mandatory high-level requirements. And I would say that they fulfilled most of the shoulds as well.
I'll just interject and give you a quick 5 minutes warning, Laurian, if that's okay.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So as this was a competitive dialogue process, each of the vendors were invited in. Full 2 days with each vendor, going through line by line all of our requirements. And we met, so that was IT services, research and enterprise division, the library, and we invited a PhD student to each one of those competitive dialogue meetings so that they could put their queries and questions to the vendors. That is our tender notice. As we know, with the EU tender system, everything's in the public domain. So there it is, the original PIN notice, the actual procurement notice, and the contract award. The one thing I will say about the weighting and award criteria, because I think this is really important, this is just a few of them here, obviously, what quality criterion you actually use. And I think you may note that the 2 most important that were viewed as most important was the functional requirements and cost. And that's probably one of the lessons learned for me, was the importance of cost in that criteria. And that did have a significant impact. I think it was a very close thing between 2 companies, but ultimately as an institution, we're thinking about costs. Split it into 2 projects, if possible. Going out for a data and a publications thesis repository at the same time was hugely challenging and difficult. this is important, within the constraints of procurement was providing feedback to the vendors, the unsuccessful vendors in particular. One was a startup company, and I think it was really, really important. And I have seen over the subsequent years, I have won a couple of contracts, which is great. So it's really important to give that feedback. Project timelines shift everywhere, as we know, taking into account local drivers remain during the implementation as well. So in 2017-19, as you probably can see there, the contract was awarded to Fixshare. We had symplectic elements in place already, so that integration is there. We've got Archivum, and we had 2 on-site appliances. But things change and move quickly. So already this year, we were realizing that we needed a digital preservation solution. So we now have the preservation module as well. So we have control in the library. We have gone totally off premise. We have nothing on premise at all now. And that is to satisfy IT's requirements because they do not have the resource to support anything in-house. That's our Fixshare. And that's my final lesson, is going through this is only the beginning. And as challenging as that may be, building your services, the human component around RDM is probably the bigger challenge, more so than this. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Laurian. I think that was a really great example of just how challenging, how many steps there are in those procurement exercises and how much it is new to so many people who are going through them. So I hope in the coming days when we focus on that, we can share lessons and really help everyone who's going through a similar exercise. So the next talk we have is on the CRIS system in Italy. So Susanna, I don't know if you are able to share your slides. Just to remind folk while we get this set up, there are some questions in the Slido. By all means, add as we go along or vote them up. And then when we break at the end, we can do the panel discussion. Excellent. Take it away.
Thank you, Sarah, very much. And thank you all for inviting me today or tonight, according to the place where we are. I'm talking about the two national models for service delivery. This is about CRIS systems, but also research data management is implied because both systems chosen by the 2 countries are also able to deliver data management services. A little bit about me. I started my career as a librarian. I was the director of the physics library and the vice director of libraries in 2 universities in northern Italy. And then I was associate at CERN, at Scientific Information Services, for 2 years. I was head of business units for institutional repositories and then CRIS systems at 2 inter-university consortia for ICT in Italy. And I'm presently Chief Operating Officer at Science. This is just to say that I know something about libraries and about the domain which lies behind the information technologies that are related to the RDM. And my present organization is a company, Science, providing services for open source institutional repositories and CRIS systems based on DSpace CRIS. We are participating in open source communities. We are promoting interoperability and contribute to open standards, open protocols, open technologies. So we are not a traditional company in this respect, but we put our accent and a lot of our effort in collaborative enterprises. We are in plenty of committees working with COAR, working with Eurocris on Serif, working with IIIF for data visualization, working with OpenAir in awarded projects and so on. So today I'm talking about 2 experiences of coordinating adoption of a CRIS platform at the national level. The first one goes back to 2014, 2015, when I was the project director of an initiative that involved 66 Italian academic institutions, which adopted the same distributed platform version of this PESCRIS called IRIS, which was customized for specifically for the Italian research evaluation exercise, and the IRIDE project for ORCID was a project about getting ORCID for all Italian researchers. This PESCRIS is an extension of this space, which allows an institution to have an institutional repository extended to cover the functions of managing all research information that is related to publications, from researcher profiles to projects, and also, of course, managing digital objects such as data sets, thesis, patents, and all this. And since its start in June 2020 this year, I'm also the project director of the Peru-CRIS knowledge platform, which is also based on this PESCRIS. And this PESCRIS was adopted by the Peruvian National Council for Science, Technology and Innovation to implement a centralized national CRIS platform. So let's start with the distributed model. In Italy, in 2006, two systems were born feeding the national database for publications. One was YouGov Research and the other one was Surplus. They were managed by two different university consortia for a total of 55 installations. There were a lot of critical issues. The most diffuse system provided no visibility because it was a closed system and it had no public portal. So the data were collected and kept at the institutional level, and they were not shared with anybody. It had poor metadata, a lot of duplicated records, poor management tools, no validation processes, resulting in poor quality of data at large. In spring 2014, these universities asked the consortium to find a solution for that. And so this IRIS platform was born from this PESCRIS. Between the autumn 2014 and the summer of 2015, we migrated to IRIS the 55 existing installations plus 11 new universities who adopted it with the advantage of, with several advantages. First of all, to have an open repository for publications and data sets together with the opportunity of providing researcher profiles, project records, and so on. To have richer metadata and to share records with other universities and at the national level through interoperability of the this new technology, which had the OAI PMH facility, and the opportunity to implement validation processes and to have overall a better quality of research information. Which were the main benefits of this countrywide adoption of this PESCRIS? First of all, this PESCRIS is open source, so it provides independency from providers. And of course, enhances sustainability from the economic and organizational point of view. SRIF compliance, so the adoption of a de facto standard for CRIS systems. Increased visibility of the national research production, because having an OAI PMH compliant repository, not just for publications, but also for all research information, allowed the opportunity to build a national harvester and expose all this research at the national level. To have more consistent data uploaded into the national database, because adopting the same technology also meant some organizational consequences, such as choosing the same standard for metadata, choosing the same organizational processes, so producing more consistent data, more consistent information and data. 3.5 million publications were available on the internet. more than 10% of them with open access full text. That at the time, 5 years ago, it was a good goal compared to non-existence of any kind of information before. And last but not least, more transparency for national research evaluation procedures. Just a parenthesis around the persistent identifier approach, which is relevant also for RDM. In April that year, the Italian National Evaluation Agency for University and Research announced ORCID to be mandatory. In June, a national agreement was signed with ORCID organization, and in September we launched the Central Italian Register, which we called the ORCID Hub, which is part of the IRID project that I mentioned before. And by November, so in 2 months, over 60,000 Italian researchers had an ORCID, which was more than 90%. So this allowed the distributed DSpace-CRIS platform to be populated with ORCIDs, which were useful to collect and normalize data at the national level with the duplication of multiple profiles. But also DSpace-CRIS can also collect other kinds of identifiers such as the Scopus ID, WOS ID, PubMed ID. It's interoperable with DataCite, of course it supports DOIs, and it's born to be interoperable with any external data source or target. So it provides an extra service to the research data management because it allows to link your data sets with the publications that are issued from the specific project, with the project record, with the authors of the publications, with the investigators of the projects, creating a network of research information within your installation. The Council of Rectors also signed a national contract with DataCite for the DOIs. So there is a national infrastructure in Italy providing both identifiers for researchers and identifiers for research objects. The lessons learned from the Italian project were several. For instance, the adoption of the same CRIS platform for all most universities is a first step towards stronger harmonization and sustainability. The built-in open repository supports open access to publications and data sets. So it's not just a CRIS system in a traditional way, but it also is also able to host properly publications and data sets. The support for persistent identifiers is enhancing data quality through disambiguation and deduplication, and contributes to a new architecture of the research information infrastructure, which should go towards persistent identifiers for each component of the research domain. And this huge amount of available data makes it possible to conduct significant research and analysis. The other model is the centralized model, which is being adopted by Peru. The CRIS National Project in Peru started with the approval by the government of the Republic of Peru in 2017. The project for the improvement and the expansion of the National System of Science, Technology and Technological Innovation, in the SINASIT, is meant to improve the performance, which implies also better management, prioritization and allocation of resources, more applied research, and especially to contribute to Peru's economic diversification and competitiveness, to help reduce the vulnerability of the productive apparatus of Peru, and to help achieve sustainable development in time based on knowledge, which is especially important for a developing country such as Peru. The Peru CRIS also has some technical goals. Particularly, it aims to harmonize and to connect research information across a variety of separate databases, which were born along the years, but with separate technologies, separate standards, and they're not interoperable. So we have a list of them. I don't want to go through the whole of it, but they have a national directory for researchers, national directory for institutions, national directory for evaluators for projects and funding. They have a national site, a national database with all the research outputs. And a national database for project records, and also a registry of individuals with specific skills in scientific research or technological development. So all these databases have a separate life, an independent life, and one of the goals of the projects from the technical point of view is to put all this information together to make it interoperable and interactive. What are the main features for this centralized platform? It will be composed of 5 directories, particularly human talents, scientific production, projects, institutions, and infrastructure, which are the 5 main entities which were chosen to model the domain of the Peruvian project. It will provide information about the actors, so the stakeholders, the activities, and the capabilities in the field of research, development, and innovation with a national coverage. It will feature a curriculum vitae of human resources, a federated authentication API, a national observatory of science, technology, and innovation, and it will provide access to sources of information and funding opportunities. And it will also provide the tools for monitoring and evaluating of the national system for science, technology, and innovation through the analysis of the information that is input in the platform. And as I said, it will be based on DSpace-CRIS, so the free open source platform for research information management. And it will adopt international standards and recommendations starting from the SERIF de facto standard for interoperability of research information. The expected benefits, as I said, it will be harmonization and connection of a variety of information sources, an enhanced control on research information and its quality, a better knowledge of the research assets of the country and the performance at the institutional and the national level, which will inform prioritization and allocation of resources for research. It will contribute to the economic diversification and competitiveness for the country, a sustainable development based on better knowledge. So, what are the conclusions here? We've seen 2 different models very briefly, but they're quite significant because they are models that were adopted by at a national level by 2 different countries, very different countries from several points of view, but for the kitchen, which is excellent in both cases. So we have the bottom-up collaboration. In the distributed model, it was the Italian universities that asked to have a unique platform to share the same technology to set up their own CRIS systems. And in the case of Peru, we have a top-down organization building a centralized model to support the country. But they both have the same goals. So first of all, to collect and manage better information, which turns to become data that are useful for the control and the resource allocation. And to provide to researchers and their institutions enhanced opportunities for development and including open access and open science through the availability of open access publications and data sets. And they have, they're supposed to have, because one of the projects just started, the same outcomes, including visibility through the availability of open portals, and sustainability. So this both a collaborative distributed initiative in Italy and a centralized initiative in Peru are based on free software and open source communities. To connect with the previous talks, which were extremely interesting, I would suggest that these two models could be an inspiration for other countries and other institutions, because collaborating together and organizing national initiatives is helping to save a lot of economic resources, organizational resources, bring skills together from different institutions, as it is so difficult nowadays to have the proper skills at the institutional level, and to have all the available figures that are needed to choose the proper infrastructure for your institution. Thank you very much for listening.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Susanna. And I completely agree about that. Trying to approach things at a national level or having a bit more collective thinking, I think is really helpful for the sector. So last but not least, we're going to hear from Caitlin Thaney on supporting open infrastructure. So by all means, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's just get this into presentation mode.
Great.
There we go. So first off, huge thanks again to Sarah and the organizing committee for the invitation to join you. It is wonderful to be kind of coming at the end of all of these really rich bits of conversation. And so I hope that this can help provide an additional lens from our work over the past few months to help augment what we've heard today. Just as a bit of a high level though, just by way of introduction. So my name's Caitlin Thaney. I'm the executive director of an organization called Invest in Open Infrastructure, which you'll hear a little bit more about. We're a sustainability initiative focused on open technology for research and for scholarship. My back history, I know there's a number of familiar faces here on the call and you know, in the little tiles. So I've spent most of my career in the open movement, both in terms of building and advocating for infrastructure at Creative Commons and Mozilla, but also was on the founding team of Digital Science, helped see the DuraSpace group through to a merger with Lyrasis, where I'm a trustee, and also most recently built a $60 million endowment for Wikipedia. And so sustainability is something that really kind of flows through my veins in a very, very visceral way from a number of different dimensions. So for the sake of this conversation, I'll be going through just some high-level overview to outline some of the key items and also definitions to guide our conversation, as well as sharing out some of the key issues that we've identified in our research, which I'll tell you a little bit more about, and some paths forward so we can lead into our discussion. In terms of how we define open infrastructure, it is a word that many people project their own work to in very different ways, we've found. But for the sake of this conversation, really thinking of infrastructure as the open tools, services, and systems that underpin research and scholarship. I like to think of infrastructure as the services that if you were to remove them, that the advancement of society would be dramatically changed. And so there is a level of sort of reliability, though that can be quite different depending on who you're talking to within disciplines and also institutions and in research. For IOI, our initial goal is really to help foster a shared, interoperable, and community-driven network of open infrastructure to advance scholarly research. And we came out of an event called the Joint Roadmap of Open Science Tools conference back in 2018, to really start digging into some of these broader sustainability challenges, not only in terms of how the systems, coming out of an event talking about a joint roadmap, but how these services can better interoperate, but also how we can start to look at some of the funding and resourcing challenges that exist in the space that can lead to this, perceived scarcity and also more of a competitive nature than collaborative. And so our focus is really about what we can do to help heighten the awareness as well as the investment and adoption of open technology in the space. And why? Well, many of the services that we rely on, depending on the level of maturation or adoption, are really in this current moment in time, especially over the past few months, coming under not only increased scrutiny, but also increased strain. I like to draw to this is fine, especially being in the US where we've got, a pretty momentous week coming up. It has really brought into stark relief some of the challenges that come along with how we currently support and also move forward some of our existing systems. To go over some top level here, when we talk about some of the usage and interoperability challenges in the space, for researchers starting their studies today, the workflows that and the tools that they're using are in many cases unlikely to exist when they earn their degree. This is something that has come into a number of different conversations in the past few months as folks have said, well, give me some examples, and I'm happy to go into that in the question and answers, because unfortunately, especially with the sweeping budget cuts and economic volatility of the last 7 or 8 months, this has become much more of the reality. But even prior to that, we are facing issues not only of discoverability, cost, and access, but also with the myriad of tools that do exist, the mechanisms to support them in the ways in which are needed to help them succeed and really scale and serve the needs that they initially were designed for. We start to come up against a number of different tensions and trade-offs. We also, and I know we have some representatives here on the call, we're also seeing this competition with commercial entities that in many cases are in fact buying up infrastructure for the data about the researchers and users of those services. There's also the resourcing challenges. This is where the majority of our work for Invest in Open Infrastructure is focused for very obvious reasons. But when we talk about this heightened competitive nature, perceived scarcity of resources, we look at things that make it hard to think about how to actually get that competitive advantage to justify the investment in open over a longer term horizon. It becomes almost a comparing of apples and oranges, especially in a marketplace that's increasingly dominated by cash-rich, commercially motivated players. Beyond that, the funding for these open tools, outside of a series of business models we're starting to see people playing around with and actually not even necessarily just are playing around with, but have operationalized over the past few years and are starting to see, that revenue generated. But also when we talk about how the majority of the sector is supported both by philanthropic funders or government funders, as well as by institutions, that funding is often time limited. It's constrained in various ways, has an upper boundary, and usually is designed to support new, not sustain or maintain those services. The costs are really difficult to manage, and this is where, for our work for Invest in Open Infrastructure, we're aiming to help shed light on what these underlying costs are, so we know what it takes to adequately resource these services in a way that does not lead to this perpetual chronic underfunding of the sector. When we talk about the development challenges, institutions have long been not only developers and originators of some of these services, but also longtime supporters of these platform-sized efforts and key innovation drivers. Again, getting back to that, what does it mean to maintain and sustain these services, especially building on the political capital in many cases of, advocating for budgets to be dedicated towards open technology, only to recognize that the development staff that you would need to be able to amend that code to meet the needs of an institution are coming up against a number of different constraints. What's needed to be competitive? We often hear that for many of these procurement processes and tenders, that when coming up against vendors who can offer lobbyists better, support and delivery, end-to-end services, focus sales pipelines and professionals for that, that it's, often easier to pay an invoice and switch to open. And that return on investment is not always clear, because when we talk about those performance metrics, it becomes difficult to start to map those to the space. And then there's also the issues around equity and access. When we speak about the value of shared infrastructure, even open infrastructure, there's been a number of conversations from Open Access Week, which just concluded recently, where the focus was for the third year running around equity and inclusion, taking action. This idea of, who these infrastructures are for, what they enable, what participation looks like, it often favors the well-resourced Western institutions and scholars. We are acutely aware at our work in Invest in Open Infrastructure that we are building on a stack, a cake, if you will, of systemic inequities when we talk about not only those that already exist in open technology, that and open source development, but then additionally in the higher ed and institutional ecosystem, and then layer onto that investment and capital over longer term horizons around sustainability. And we really need to think about this, and find ways to address these multi-level barriers, not only for the equitable access, but also who, is able to participate. And so I would ask, what voices are missing, and how are these perhaps countering our shared community and institutional values? So as I mentioned, we've been working on this for a number of months. I personally joined IOI as the first staff person the day that New York City, where I live, went into lockdown. And so again, really taking into stark relief some of these issues around investments in technology, as we've seen increased asks for, service, as well as access to content and data at institutions and in research organizations. I like to think of the measures of resilience here of time to survive and time to recover, which were recently spoken about at the beginning of the pandemic by Siddhartha Mukherjee, as ways to, measure the resilience of a system. And I bring this up because we've seen from institutions that we've been working with and helping to advise this real moment as, the pandemic really kicked into high gear and the economic volatility started to become more acutely felt of, do we lock into our current work that we're doing right now, lock into our current services and contracts to help ensure continuity, or do we take this as a moment to radically rethink the way in which we operate? And so that we're not, locking ourselves into, downstream effects and decisions that might affect our work for years to come. And, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up this notion of disaster capitalism, of, the exploitation of crises for private profit. We've seen this with the announcements of, Nature and Max Planck. We've seen this with the increased commercialization from for-profit publishers, some of which I used to work adjacent to in terms of commercializing services. But also, from Naomi Klein, who helped popularize the idea of disaster capitalism in her book, The Shock Doctrine, this crisis, like earlier ones, could be a catalyst to shower aid on the wealthiest interests in society, including those most responsible for our current vulnerabilities. We're firm believers that invest in open infrastructure, and I'll share a bit of our findings from our current research effort, which is now about 4.5 months in, that the choices that we make for the technology and also the services that we employ, the people we partner with, dramatically affect and also are part of the picture when we talk about furthering open access and open research. And for that work, some of these defining considerations come to the forefront. What counts as open or critical or necessary infrastructure when we talk about sustainability? Are we all aligned in terms of how we're defining those elements? Who does that service or technology help serve? Who does that help reach? Does that align with our values? Who gets to decide? Whose needs come first, especially when we're looking at groups, say, within the libraries or within research departments or IT, versus the needs of domains, institutions, regions, consortia. How do we reconcile tensions and conflict as a community and as a sector? And, question for the providers on the call, are our providers giving back? Is there reciprocity? What does that look like, and where can that possibly grow? The work, as I mentioned, when we started back in March, recognizing that ground beneath us was rapidly shifting, but also we knew a number of these issues were coming to a forefront prior to, what happened at the beginning of this year with the various crises we were at the confluence of. And so we bake our work around the following key assumptions. One, that openness is going to be more radically accepted and even demanded than ever post-crisis. And we're starting to see this and also moving that forward in terms of policy, as well as just, the increased awareness around why many of us have been advocating for open systems for 15 to 20 years. That key infrastructure pieces are at risk of going out of business or consolidating by the end of the year, when we should plan for that reality. The funding landscape has continued to shift and is going to be radically different even after this coming week and the election that we're seeing, forcing institutions and providers to do more with less and think beyond their walls about different models. And investments in technology will be under heightened scrutiny, especially as we're looking at additional waves of budget constraints. And I know in North America we're looking at those additional waves going through at least 2022, if not far longer than that. And those additional levels of scrutiny are, in fact, looking at mission alignment, cost, return on investment, value to users, and external influence. So as I mentioned, for our work for IOI, we approach these issues in a couple of key ways. On one end, we conduct research, and we have a project currently up and running called the Future of Open Scholarship, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. But we've also run different surveys and census in the past to help better understand the current landscape, the funding models, the costs associated, et cetera. We craft resources to help institutional leaders as well as other funders in the space better assess, vet technology, make decisions, and also map that to their budgets and investments to better understand how we can sustain collectively this work. And also we pilot solutions and coordinate stakeholders to help increase the sustainability of the sector. And that's really about how we start to put this into action. As I mentioned, there have been a number of different landscape surveys that we've been a part of and help support through our steering committee prior to my joining the organization, as well as where that's kind of continued. I will make these slides available so you can dig into this information, but these were both efforts to, in building off of the Mapping the Scholarly Communication Landscape Survey, the European survey through Spark Europe that just came out last week, the report. I encourage you all to read it, but looking into not only the different levels of open scholarly infrastructures and open science infrastructures, but also the different things around their business model, sustainability, governance, transparency, adherence to various values and principles as well. As I mentioned, in the midst of the pandemic, we were getting IOI off the ground. We heard from a number of different institutional decision makers, largely from the libraries, say, listen, we know that we need some support in terms of not just pigeonholing our own decision making, but looking a little bit broader and working with others to try to figure out how we can sustain infrastructure collapse, essentially, and looking at ways we can ensure that 12 to 18 months down the road, we're not making decisions that will, further harm or be a detriment to the sector. So we stood up a call for, involvement for research organizations and also institutional partners. That drew an interest of over 98 participants from 18 countries and 5 continents. I will note that that was self-selected and grew quite quickly. So there is more dominance in the US and in North America than in other areas of the world. But over the course of the month of July and early August, we conducted over 55 hours of interviews with these institutional leaders and their staffs to better understand their dependencies on infrastructure, budget constraints, needs, risks assessed, and thresholds for change. Part of this work, as we moved forward into a series of workshops and co-designing, the underpinning of what it means to help build this towards collective action and collective power, as well as funding models, was around values. And so these high-level points here came out of some robust workshops we ran with these participants and library leaders to say, what do you prioritize at your institution and also personally within the discipline? And you hear things here that, around embracing diverse perspectives, maximizing opportunity, centering justice and equity, operating with integrity and prioritizing care, as well as looking at societal benefit as well as environmental footprint, which actually comes into focus when we start talking about high performance computing and other technology services, as well as how these can be applied to budget decision making and also assessment of services that they are looking to employ at their institutions. Some of these here will seem very familiar. There have been conversations around governance, around community-owned engagement, oversight, transparency, but also transparency in terms of pricing, looking at not only the code and the underlying data, but also what helps these budget owners understand not only how to map their values to these services, but also is this service something that they want to partner with for a longer period of time? Does it help them achieve their broader aims, serve their communities, and do so in a way that they can trust? What does it look like to be able to scale or to have a reliable or durable service? Things that move beyond, a checklist of, is the code open and is the data open? Looking at what it means to have language diversity, market influence, operational sustainability, as well as technical sustainability. And then lastly, as we've heard, and I know Kevin had kicked off by talking about cost, and Laurian as well, when we talk about the mechanisms to counter lock-in and to understand the dependencies for these services, as well as the need to think about the transparent pricing, where does that start to map into the decisions for these institutions? Some of the key tension points that have arisen in this work, in terms of time, the immediacy of the decisions that we're making, versus, what's invested and what's available. In many of these cases, they've had to stand up services, and we've seen this with learning information systems. Some of the commercial services that have been chosen just to be able to help scale online learning quickly are now starting to have questions around the privacy and security of the students and what that means. In terms of prioritization, when we talk about near-term gain as well as the longer-term investment, how do we bridge that gap? Whose values get applied? How open are we looking for these services? What sort of trade-offs do we make, and how comfortable are we with those as a community as well as an institution? And also, being conscious of the fact that, in some of these decisions, it favors either the usual suspects or the bigger players. Again, we're talking about rolling these out across an entire institution. Are there ways in which we can better support others so that we can ensure that we're not making decisions to compromise our values based on size, but also working to do that more holistically across the network? As I mentioned, we are in the process in this work of now taking and we've run workshops not only on decision-making frameworks, but also on economic models and collective funding models, turning those over, kind of building on what Kevin had talked about, but getting into some of the nitty-gritty about what doesn't work about these models, what is needed to make that succeed. Where can we start to think about these shared service models? One of the things that this work will lead in terms of a very sort of applied research focus is providing a set of recommendations, both across the time horizon spec'd out here. Near term, say in the next 6 months, medium term, the next year, and then longer term. And really thinking with this group and working with them over the next few weeks about what it means to map these into implementation plans and roadmaps so that we can start to move that towards action. But I will just say that in terms of the near-term recommendations, there are questions here about how can we work with the existing investments we've made and the existing technology and systems that are up at our institutions, as well as with some of the staffing constraints, with some of the hiring freezes and limitations. And so much of that focus there is around interoperability. Can we get our systems to better talk to one another so that we can actually have knowledge exchange and provide that level of support? On the medium term, which I know has been touched on by a couple of the speakers so far, where can we leverage existing models and frameworks, thinking of consortia, thinking of places where there are histories of shared resourcing models, even in some of the national frameworks, to, again, not just be focusing on philanthropic funding, government funding, or national funding, or institutional support, but thinking about places where, shared, membership-based services have been built in, but possibly have been used to support, shifts from the print model to collective buying clubs. Are there opportunities there where we can start to align those budgets a little bit more to understand the necessary coupling and keeping those more tightly coupled of the technology choices we make with open access and open data sharing? And then longer term, what does it look like to transform our support models? And so thinking through at all of these various levels, are there places that we can not only better interact with consortia, but also call for service providers and others who are, deriving value, economic value off of contributing to these communities to give back in a financial way, to do so in a way that's aligned with these values, to think about what technology oversight looks like to help better understand these decisions and do so in a collective fashion. So stay tuned for more. This project goes to the end of the year and we'll be sharing out more openly. In conclusion, I just encourage this group to remember that to really achieve some of the ideals that I know have been echoed around open research and open data sharing, we need to invest in and prioritize the infrastructure. The ease of use and the ease of standing up a service in some of these commercial providers, in many cases, is no longer enough, and that scrutiny is coming if we haven't already seen it already. And so always here to help and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Caitlin. Lots of really interesting work there and lots of thought provocation as well, which will feed into the panel. So we have got a number of kind of questions on the Slido. Let me go to screen share just so that you can see this. You can see my Twitter first, actually. Let me come back to the Slido instead. And what I'd like to do is really just invite the panelists to reflect on some of these points. So the question that's had the most votes so far is actually one that Kevin had raised. So I don't know if you want to kick us off here, Kevin, what provoked this question from you, but asking whether we're worried that outsourcing data services might lead to key skills being lost by the research community, whether it's a one-way street, whether I guess there's ways we can partner and make sure that we're doing things more as a sector.
Yeah, I mean, it is that worry that, again, it's about balancing these, the short term against the long term. And it's partly based on observation, I think, from outsourcing more generally. A book I read some years ago by Helen Margetts, who's now at the Oxford Internet Institute, looking at outsourcing of IT in government and observing there that government departments that once had a really good understanding of the type of IT infrastructure they wanted, even when they were working with external companies to deliver it, now basically just consisted of experts in procurement. And you go from one step where you no longer have the technical expertise in-house to build what you want, and you might think that's acceptable. But before long, you no longer even have the expertise even to specify what you want, because the world has moved on so much. And I worry that's not a place we want to be in, and it can happen very rapidly, whereas at the moment much of what we're using is being built within the sector by us.
Would any of the other speakers want to, Caitlin, do you want to reflect on that?
Well, I was just going to build on what Kevin had said, because I do think that that's something that we hear come up time and time again in terms of the balance of efficiencies, right? And listen, I'm not going to be the person that's going to tell a library to completely cancel every single for-profit commercial provider that they work with right now. I mean, there are certain elements of need in terms of keeping some of those things moving. I do think that your question there around especially the level of scrutiny and also understanding enough about the system to be able to map out, what's needed, where there are gaps, where there are challenges is still quite needed. Something that we've heard from this research effort is also wondering, where the broader community can help provide some of that support. So it's not just falling on perhaps one institution or another. And I know we've started to hear and some of the discussions around Zoom versus Jitsi and, Zoom canceling conferences on censorship. What does it mean to have a broader technical oversight board as a community function, and almost that can sort of consumer watchdog element. I do wonder if there's places there as well to help build in some of that additional know-how for the broader services on a community level, in addition to that, to help kind of gird against that.
Definitely. Laurian or Susanna, do you want to comment on this question as well? Or
Well, yes, thanks. I think there's a reality or a need for more and more extreme specialization in skills. No one can afford being an expert in all fields, and nobody can be autonomous in operating all activities related to research, for instance. Universities are losing all the software programmers, for instance. So I think that there's a need for more and more collaboration. A solution for choosing the best option for your institution is to participate in communities where these solutions are built, and be part of the landscape, purchasing a software solution that is produced by commercial for-profit companies, a proprietary solution that locks you in for years, where you do not have any opportunity to change it for your needs, or to do it in a sustainable way, is can be avoided by collaboration. If universities stand alone in this choice processes, this is a risk.
Yeah, I think one of the points you touched on there about universities losing their software developers is often what leads, to people having to outsource. And then there is that risk, if you're not doing things in partnership, if you've not got, good user groups for some of the commercial options, and maybe you can't influence the roadmaps in the same way.
Yeah.
And
I think that, this is where what Susanna has talked about is a great example of how to get around that risk, where avoiding what happens in one individual institution affecting all of us, and indeed what Caitlin touched on as well. We've got great hopes for what we might see for Investing Open in learning how to avoid these traps.
Yeah. Laurian, there is a question here that's kind of directed at you that was about the procurement exercise at Leicester. You'd mentioned you'd had, I think it was 30 odd responses, and then there were 3 that were shortlisted. And there's a question about whether there were any open technology solutions in that finalist pool. And if not, if you've got a hunch as to why, or I don't know if you want to reflect on the exercise and maybe things that you'd do differently in future.
We're still being recorded, isn't it? As well, because I've got confidentiality things.
I can stop the recording.
Yeah, that may be an idea.
Yeah. Or
I think I'm recording. I'm pausing the recording right now.
You pause the recording. Thanks, Mark.
It's recording.
Great.
Okay.
So huge thanks to Laurian, who just kind of shared some additional insight. I have to say that one of the big things, and this is why I'm so excited that IOI is coming about at this time, outside of the fact that it provides me with a job, very grateful, all of that sort of stuff, is the fact that when we talk about like the cost for actually building out this work, and frankly, like I would love to be able to get to a point to say, okay, here are the upfront costs of transferring to this system and transitioning. Here are the gains that you're going to get in 3 years. It is so difficult to even be able to tell the top 5 philanthropies in the US how much they've invested in open research infrastructure in the past 3 years. And it is insane, right? It's hampering our ability to even wield those swords in ways that they should be. And I'm fired up about it. So like, if anyone wants to dig into like what the actual costs are for maintenance, so that we can be better equipped, so that we can come back to the sticker shock and say, listen, yes, this might be more than you think, but open is not free. You will get these sorts of gains over the course of time. These are the things that that are costs underneath, that if you were looking at, say, like, you don't question providing Microsoft seat licenses so that people can have access to services. You don't question providing, Google services so that people can have email and docs and Meet and all that sort of stuff. And it's like, I think that there are different ways in which we can kind of move that forward, but there's a lot of ground to cover. So if anyone knows someone that really likes puzzles and wants to kind of get into that analysis, please do let me know.
Excellent. So maybe we should pick up this question then about how much we should be thinking collectively as a sector. and, you know, assessing the different options for services, because I think potentially we do, you know, we are entering certain risks when we're approaching things just as single universities, but I think it's actually challenging going beyond that. So Laurian had mentioned about, you know, it's a competitive game as well. You, as an individual institution, you want to be a leader, and sometimes the partnerships can be difficult to broker. I don't know, Susanna, you've obviously managed this at national level with the CRIS systems. I know Marta and colleagues have had partnerships at universities at Delft, for example, across 4TU. So I don't know if some people would like to speak to this.
From my point of view, I think Kevin very nicely summarized that there are, I think, big opportunity gains, there are big advantages of going together, of joining forces, that there are definitely opportunities, there are also challenges. And I agree, especially with what Kevin said, at some point, you know, that becomes also exhaustive with the turnover of staff members. How many times do you know, have to align the mission and values, the expectations of different partners? So yeah, I think there are strong advantages, strong drivers for why we should indeed partners. That just makes sense. You know, if you can join up and do things together, you don't want to reinvent the wheel, you just save money in the long term. But indeed, there are challenges associated with that. So I think, you know, you have to see what's best in a given circumstance, and if partnership is the best model in that particular situation. As I think Kevin summarized it very nicely. I don't think I have anything to add to that.
Well, I just said, no, I certainly would. You invited Susanna to respond, and I'd certainly like to hear from her, because it's a real story of success there. But I think one added observation I'd say is that I think one trick we miss is that most universities are involved in some kind of membership organization at national level, at regional level, or something like that. And in some cases, but I think not enough, we see those organizations themselves acting collectively, and not necessarily driving procurement, but sometimes at that level you can bring into being community-based solutions. And I think we don't use these membership organizations as well as we might. Now, obviously, you know, the one thing to be aware of here is that it's not just universities we're talking about here, it's all sorts of research performing organizations. But I think if you build something that works for one large group, it's likely to be a benefit to others as well. And it's important then to construct the club in such a way that those other types of organizations can join in with you and make it stronger.
Definitely. Yeah, there are numerous groups you could use. Susanna?
Yeah, as a service provider, I noticed that if you want to participate in a collaborative enterprise, you have to give up some of your requirements. But this also happens within your institution, because different communities, disciplinary communities within your institution may have different needs. So it is always a question of balancing requirements and trying to identify the common needs and the most important ones. Some differences that universities pretend to have with respect to others are really specious. So it's really a question of identifying what is really relevant in this process of choosing your solution.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Susanna. Monica, do you want to ask a question?
Was that no, I actually wanted to comment on that.
Yeah.
Because although of course we all go for open source solutions when possible, always one would have to think also about the time that requires us investment, and how much our institutions are willing also to wait for that. So right now, actually, we are also thinking as institution in the University of Cologne to make an institutional repository. We are trying to do it with an open source based solution. Actually, we have the infrastructure, we don't have the personnel, but the question usually we get from our stakeholders is, okay, how much is the license? How much it costs? And when is it ready? No, so kind of, okay, we want a just ready to use product as soon as possible, and please fast, and that it works and that we are all happy, kind of. So this kind of the issue of, okay, that requires time. This is a solution that has to be adopted and see how do we fit the necessities of the researchers and etc. That takes time and that needs people, that needs personnel, and there is kind of a different cost, and of course goes attached with risks and so on and so forth. So yeah, that is also other points to think about.
Yeah, no, completely. I think often that pressure that you need a solution, you need it fast, and you've got to meet all these set requirements, that can, you know, really kind of sway the process that you follow. There's actually a couple of questions in the Slido that kind of pick up on these procurement aspects. So the one from Rosie about Laurian's comment on the risks of lock-in, and if it's possible to address this through procurement. And then also Tamsin had asked about how we engage more with senior managers and procurement departments who appear more interested in proprietary solutions or potentially have some kind of set requirements that might close off the market more to more open source ones. Does anyone want to reflect on some of those as kind of closing remarks?
I can jump in just quickly.
Yeah, go ahead, Caitlin.
I mean, this is one of the biggest elements that we hear about in terms of the need for case making, of, you know, the disconnect between some of the individuals and the decision-making seats, and also where people are situated to power to be able to make these decisions more fully. And I use those words very sort of deliberately in terms of, you know, what resonates and what helps move those conversations forward. And so that's something that I'm really keen to explore, ways in which we can creatively get these messages across in formats that resonate, whether it's, you know, how a consultant puts something together or otherwise. Like, if there's a way in which this can get translated to be a comparison that provides sort of the no-brainer yes in terms of moving in one direction, we need to start thinking about ways to get there. And doing so as a community to kind of share successes and failures, I think, is really key to that.
Laurian, did you unmute there, or Kevin?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Laurian.
To Rosie's question about lock-in, you know, we're being pulled into this very much a corporate kind of, you know, but certainly from our perspective, I know that the procurement process itself and the procurement department certainly wouldn't have, how can I say, that would have influenced, you know, it was the constraints of the process in a way that it felt that we were going through, you know, and that had a huge influence. I can say with us, certainly with our solution, the fact that one of the most mandatory things was the interoperability and integration of your CRIS with the platform was the highest level mandatory function. When we had a combined data publications repository, that's when it became mandatory. When we were going just initially for the data, that actually wasn't a high level mandatory requirement because we weren't going to integrate with our CRIS. So that would have brought in different, I think. Yeah. That's why I'm saying, would it have been better to have had two processes? I can't speak for all institutions, but it just feels very much that this is the way that it is or has been, you know. I'm hoping that there will be something different, and I think I can only speak from our institution, which was very much about the lack of local support, or particularly from the IT perspective. You know, we couldn't even have any kind of customization of our publications repository. The version we were using was so out of date. The library had lost its metadata, its systems team, you know, so it all kind of brings it together that in a way, as a service provider, and also thinking about the users, you do get moved into this more sustainable, with service level agreements that you can influence roadmap. And so it's a much clearer path from a service provider in a way, instead of this wishful thinking about, could you possibly customize the institutional repository institutionally, where we wait 2 years, whereas with the provider, your expectation, you can push a little bit more. So how you avoid lock-in, I really don't know.
Yeah.
And is it lock-in? I don't know.
Well, I mean, part of me wonders whether if we had more collective agreements, you could get a better deal there, and you could, you know, have stronger stipulations if it wasn't just one institution, you know, making that deal. But Kevin, did you want to come in?
Yeah, on the lock-in, one lesson I was taught very early on by older, wiser, more experienced colleagues is that one should never start using any solution in IT without working out how you were going to stop using it and move to something else. It was a fundamental thing, the assumption that none of these things are going to last more than a few years, and you will want to have as many options when one thing reaches the end of its life as you had at the beginning. And locking often occurs because we fail to plan for that. We fail to challenge suppliers, or in some cases, it's not the supplier's fault. We fail to think about it ourselves. I'd love to say that just telling people that is the answer. Unfortunately, bitter experience, including in University of Edinburgh, I know it's not. One other point, one of the other questions about convincing senior management, I was really struck by some points, I think, on one of Caitlin's last slide about values. I think there's more we can do perhaps to tie in things to some universities' mission statements, and often commitments to inclusion and things like that, which if we translate into procurement, and it's worked, for instance, in things like catering in universities with commitments to fair trade supplies and things like that, it can be used to influence that. If you can convince senior management about, hey, our mission says this, and we're not acting in accordance with the values expressed in that.
Yeah, good point. Now, I'm conscious of time. We are up the end of the 2 hours. So I would just like to say a huge thank you to everyone who's presented today. Really inspiring talks, and I think they're very good kind of scene setting for what we'll cover in the following sessions, the next 4 nights. And also to all of you for attending, for asking the questions. All the slides are already online, and we'll get this recording up ASAP. So if there's anything you missed or you want to share with colleagues, by all means, send that through. So yeah, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your days or mornings or evenings, and maybe see you again in one of the other sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for getting us all here, and thanks everyone. It's great.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you.